The air in courtroom 5 of the Montgomery County Courthouse in Rockville, Maryland, was thick with the usual dullness of a Tuesday morning. Brianna Johnson, as Brenda Jackson, the public defender, stood at the judge's podium, her voice clear and calm, presenting her closing arguments in a seemingly insignificant lease dispute. Her client, Robert Miller, a mild-mannered middle-aged man, sat nervously at the defense table, his hands clasped together. Brianna was concentrating on reciting a provision of Maryland's housing code when she felt someone move too close behind her. A feeling of unease washed over her. She glanced over her shoulder and saw Deputy Chief Arthur Art Doyle standing there, arms crossed, an expression of impatience and open contempt on his face. He was a large man, about 45, with a beer belly visible under his brown uniform and a red face lined with gruffness. "Hey, Afro," Doyle said. Not loud, but loud enough for everyone nearby, including the judge and the clerk's desk, to hear. The word Afro was deliberately emphasized, referring to Brianna's naturally curly black hair. "Can you speak up a little? We have more important things to do than stand here listening to you nag about this stupid lease all day." Brianna stifled a sigh. There she was again. This wasn't the first time she'd witnessed or been the target of Doyle's condescending and discriminatory behavior. She turned slowly, facing him directly, trying to keep her voice calm and professional. "Deputy Sheriff Doyle, I'm making my closing argument. Please maintain order and respect the court's due process." Standing not far away, near the door, was Officer Tim O'Malley, a younger man, about 30, with short blonde hair and a permanent smirk. He chuckled at Doyle's words. "Art's right, attorney," O'Malley chimed in, his tone mocking. "You look a little nervous. Your face is all red. Maybe you're not used to a real courtroom." He emphasized the word real, implying that her job as a small-time public defender was insignificant, and adding a sexist slur. Brianna's patience was beginning to be tested, but her facade demanded restraint. She glanced at O'Malley with a cold gaze, then looked up at Judge Arnold Henderson, who sat on the dais, looking tired and slightly annoyed at the interruption. "Your Honor," Brianna said, her voice still respectful, "I would like the officers on duty to maintain order so I can complete my statement." Judge Henderson, an older man with white hair and thick glasses, cleared his throat. He clearly didn't want any more trouble. "Deputy Sheriff Doyle, Officer O'Malley, please," he said, his voice even but lacking in intensity. "Let the attorney present. We need to move on." The judge's weak admonition only seemed to add fuel to Doyle's fire. Humiliated by a black female lawyer and a seemingly indifferent judge, he felt his authority challenged. He took a step toward Brianna, his face red with anger. "Don't give me orders, do you understand?" he growled, pointing a finger at Brianna. "In this courtroom, we are the ones keeping order, and you're causing trouble." To everyone's surprise, Doyle suddenly reached out and grabbed Brianna's upper arm. It was an act that crossed all boundaries, a blatant physical attack. Brianna instinctively jerked her hand out of Doyle's grasp. "Don't touch me," she blurted, her voice filled with indignation. "Aha! Resisting a law enforcement officer," Doyle shouted, seeing Brianna's defensive reaction as the perfect excuse he had been looking for. "You dare resist? Okay. O'Malley, handcuff her now. Arrest her for disorderly conduct and resisting a law enforcement officer." O'Malley, like a puppet on strings, rushed forward. Doyle and O'Malley together restrained Brianna, who, though surprised, did not panic. They quickly twisted her arms behind her back. The cold, metallic click of handcuffs cut through the deadly silence that had fallen over the courtroom. Brianna's client, Mr. Miller, gasped in horror and jumped out of his chair. The opposing attorney and his client also froze, eyes wide with disbelief. The court clerk dropped his pen. Judge Henderson stood up, shock and helplessness evident on his face. Brianna stood there, her hands cuffed behind her back, the sharp pain in her wrists reminding her of the harsh reality. But in her eyes, there was no fear or despair, but an odd calm, a sharp concentration. The small pin on the lapel of her suit jacket, actually a micro camera, was still silently recording everything. Her investigation had just taken an unexpected turn. Why should a lawyer be treated like a criminal, handcuffed in the middle of doing his job, right in front of a judge? Who are these two policemen that they can act so arbitrarily and disregard the law and due process? What the hell really happened before that led to this horrible and absurd escalation? And most importantly, who is that handcuffed woman standing there with a terrifying calmness? Listen to the whole story from the beginning to understand better. The woman who had just been handcuffed in an ignominious manner in the middle of a courtroom was not Brenda Jackson, a relatively unknown public defender recently relocated to Maryland. That identity was a carefully crafted cover. Her real name was Brianna Johnson, and she was a senior investigative special agent in the Office of Inspector General, OIG, of the U.S. Department of Justice, and the DOJ. Brianna, 48, is one of the OIG's most experienced and skilled investigators. She and her colleagues investigate the most sensitive and complex allegations of misconduct, corruption, abuse of power, and civil rights violations within law enforcement agencies and the judicial system, from the federal to the local level. She has not only the sharp mind of a lawyer, but also the nerves of steel and the skills of a highly trained agent. Before joining the OIG, she spent many years as a federal prosecutor, specializing in corruption and organized crime, an experience that has given her a deep understanding of how the system works from both sides. Brianna's appearance was not particularly remarkable. She was not very tall, with a slim figure, and a pleasant face with intelligent brown eyes that were always observant and analytical. Her naturally curly black hair, which Doyle had just mocked, was usually tied back or simply left loose. This somewhat ordinary appearance was an advantage in her undercover work. She could blend into many different environments without raising suspicion. The reason Special Agent Brianna Johnson was in the Montgomery County Courthouse under the guise of attorney Brenda Jackson was because of a long-running and increasingly troubling investigation. Over the past 18 months, the OIG has received a series of complaints, both anonymous and formal, against the deputy sheriffs who work at the courthouse, Arthur Doyle and Officer Timothy O'Malley. The allegations were wide-ranging and serious. They included racist language and conduct directed at lawyers, defendants, witnesses, and even jurors of color or other minorities. Sexism was also a persistent issue, with Doyle showing particular disdain and hostility toward female lawyers, frequently making derogatory or demeaning comments about their abilities. There were also allegations of blatant abuse of power, intimidation of lawyers and members of the public, deliberate attempts to restrict access to the courthouse, arbitrary and unnecessary searches of persons and belongings, and even excessive use of force in maintaining order in the courthouse. More seriously, there are unconfirmed suspicions that Doyle, with O'Malley's help, accepted large bribes to turn a blind eye or facilitate certain situations. For example, allowing acquaintances to bring prohibited items, such as cell phones with cameras, into the courtroom, or providing inside information about trial schedules, or simply treating certain people more leniently when they were disruptive. The OIG's initial investigation was fraught with difficulty. Doyle and O'Malley were shrewd. They often committed their crimes when there was no live surveillance camera or when their superiors were not present. Those who dared to come forward with complaints were often retaliated against by making it even more difficult for them to do their jobs or go to court. Doyle had worked at the courthouse for more than 20 years, had a wide network of contacts, and had built up a near untouchable status with many court staff and even some judges. He knew how to exploit loopholes in the system and the reticence of others. Given the situation, OIG decided it needed direct, irrefutable evidence, and the best way to do that was to send a special agent into the courtroom environment. Brianna Johnson was chosen for this challenging assignment. She spent weeks building the cover of Brenda Jackson, a newly transferred public defender from another state looking for experience into Maryland. The county public defender's office, after receiving a fake but carefully prepared resume and letter of recommendation from the OIG, agreed to take her on and assigned her a number of small, low-profile cases. Robert Miller's civil lease dispute was one such case. It was perfect for Brianna's purposes. Small enough to not attract media attention or high-profile attorneys, but large enough to require her to be in the Montgomery County Courthouse regularly, walking the halls, interacting with court staff, and most importantly, having the opportunity to interact and observe Doyle and O'Malley in their natural working environment. Brianna doesn't rely solely on her keen sense of observation. She is armed with sophisticated surveillance technology. The fountain pen she keeps tucked into her clipboard is actually a high-quality recording device. The small metal lapel pin on her suit jacket is a tiny camera capable of recording both images and sounds at incredible resolution. She has been extensively trained in the use of these devices, discreetly and effectively. In the weeks leading up to that fateful day in Courtroom 5, Brianna, under the guise of Brenda Jackson, had been quietly observing and recording hours of evidence. She had recorded racist private conversations between Doyle and O'Malley in the courthouse cafeteria. She had recorded Doyle harassing an elderly Latina woman at a security checkpoint, forcing her to open her handbag and explain each item in a humiliating manner. She had recorded O'Malley's lewd comments about female lawyers who passed in the hallway. She had also noted the permissive, even dismissive, attitudes of some court staff and even some judges toward Doyle's clearly inappropriate behavior. It seemed that people had become too accustomed or too afraid to speak up. Brianna knew she had vital evidence, but she needed a trigger, an event powerful enough to completely expose these two and force the system to act. Little did she know she was about to be the catalyst for that event, right in the middle of the courtroom, in front of everyone. Her cover was about to be tested to the limit. Courtroom 5 is not the most formal room in the Montgomery County Courthouse. The cream paint has yellowed with age, and the wood paneling and chairs are scratched and discolored. But it is still a place where justice is done, or at least it should be. The American flag and the Maryland state flag stand solemnly on either side of the raised podium where Judge Arnold Henderson sits, looking weary as he examines the day's backlog of cases. Mr. Miller's lease trial was supposed to be just a blip on that busy schedule. The plaintiff, the landlord, and his attorney all seemed anxious to get it over with. Only Mr. Miller, Brianna's client, seemed genuinely nervous because the outcome of the case directly affected his housing situation. Brianna, as Brenda Jackson, presented her defense in a clear and concise manner. She cited contract terms, emails exchanged between the two parties, and Maryland housing laws to defend Mr. Miller's interests. Her professional, confident demeanor, despite the small case, seemed to put Deputy Sheriff Doyle off from the start. He began with subtle disruptions. While Brianna was questioning Mr. Miller on the witness stand, Doyle deliberately paced back and forth behind the defense table, his shoes clicking on the wooden floor in a distracting way. He sighed loudly several times, rolling his eyes at the ceiling as if he were suffering. He even whispered something in O'Malley's ear, causing both of them to cover their mouths with laughter. Brianna initially tried to ignore it, focusing on her work. But when the disruption became too obvious, she was forced to stop and politely turn to Doyle. "Deputy Sheriff, please be quiet while the trial is in progress," she said, her voice respectful but firm. This reasonable request seemed to anger Doyle. Perhaps he was not used to being reminded of his code of conduct by a lawyer, especially of a black woman whom he considered lower class in his own territory. His gaze toward Brianna turned hostile. The situation escalated quickly as Brianna began her final argument, when Doyle approached her and made derogatory comments about her frizzy hair and talking. This behavior was no longer casual harassment, but outright humiliation, based on both race and gender. Brianna, despite the anger boiling inside her, still tried to handle the situation according to procedure. She did not argue directly with Doyle, but looked up to ask for the intervention of the highest authority in the courtroom, Judge Henderson. She believed that the judge would recognize the wrongdoing and take strong corrective measures. Judge Henderson's response, however, was disappointing. His admonition, "Please let the lawyer speak," was too gentle, lacking the dignity and firmness needed to deter someone like Doyle. Perhaps he was too accustomed to Doyle's demeanor. Perhaps he was afraid of confrontation, or perhaps he simply did not fully appreciate the seriousness of the discrimination that was taking place right before his eyes. Whatever the reason, the judge's lack of firmness sent the wrong message. Doyle's behavior, while wrong, was not a big deal. For Doyle, it was a green light. He felt he had been spared, that he could go further. His anger at being humiliated earlier, combined with the inherent racism and sexism, pushed him over the edge. He moved closer, his voice threatening. Don't give me orders. Do you understand? In this courtroom, we are the ones who keep order. And you are causing trouble. And then the unthinkable happened. Doyle reached out and grabbed Brianna's arm. It wasn't a gentle touch, but a forceful grip, a blatant physical assault that violated every rule of conduct, every legal standard, right in the place that was supposed to be the sanctuary of justice. Brianna's instinct to defend herself was to jerk her hand away and scream, "Don't touch me!" It was a perfectly natural reaction for anyone caught off guard. But for Doyle, it was the perfect excuse to make the final move in his sick show of power. "Aha! Obstructing an officer," he roared, eyes bulging. He didn't need another second to think. "O'Malley, handcuff her. Arrest her for disorderly conduct in obstructing an officer." O'Malley, eager to curry favor and demonstrate his authority, obeyed immediately. The two large men tackled Brianna. Though surprised and angry, Brianna did not struggle beyond the initial jerk. She knew that resistance would only make matters worse and could jeopardize her cover and her mission. She let them twist her hands behind her back, feeling the cold metal as the handcuffs tightened around her wrists. The click of the handcuffs rang out like a gunshot in the deadly silence of the courtroom. All proceedings came to an abrupt halt. All eyes were on the absurd scene unfolding. A lawyer was handcuffed in the middle of a court session by the court's own security officers, simply for daring to ask them to respect the process and protect themselves from attack. Doyle and O'Malley stood there panting, looking at the handcuffed Brianna with a mixture of triumph and gloating. They believed they had succeeded in teaching this arrogant black lawyer a lesson, asserting who was truly in charge in this courtroom. Little did they know their stupid and brutal actions had just buried their own careers, and they had done it in front of the cameras and microphones of the person they had just attacked. The rudeness had officially become a crime, and the evidence was irrefutable. A heavy, almost stifling silence fell over courtroom 5 after the cold snap of the handcuffs. Time seemed to stand still. Doyle and O'Malley stood tall, trying to regain their composure after the violence, their eyes full of satisfaction as they looked at Brianna. They had won. They had proven their power. Little did they know that this brief moment of triumph was about to turn into their worst nightmare. Brianna, her wrists aching from being cuffed behind her back, turned slowly. She didn't look down at the ground in resignation or fear. Instead, she held her head high, her gaze strangely calm, as she scanned the discolored face of Judge Henderson on the dais, then stopped, looking directly into the eyes of Doyle and O'Malley standing directly in front of her. There was no panic, just cold determination. Then she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear, coherent, and filled with a strange authority, echoing in the absolute silence of the room. "Deputy Chief Arthur Doyle," she said his full name, emphasizing each syllable. "Officer Timothy O'Malley." Their eyes flashed with surprise, then turned to annoyance when they saw that the captive still dared to look straight at them and call their own names. Brianna continued, her voice even but razor sharp. "You two have just made a very serious mistake. A mistake that will officially end your law enforcement careers." She inclined her head slightly toward Judge Henderson, who was still standing stunned on the dais. "Judge Henderson," she said, her voice respectful but not obsequious, "I sincerely apologize for this unwanted interruption in your court. However, it appears that the undercover investigation I am conducting has come to an early conclusion. Unfortunately, it has come to an end in this very courtroom." "Secret investigation," Judge Henderson stammered, his white eyebrows furrowed. What are you talking about, Miss Jackson?" Doyle and O'Malley looked at each other, confusion and doubt beginning to show on their faces. "What nonsense are you talking about?" Doyle growled, but his voice lacked the confidence it once had. "What are you trying to do?" Brianna ignored Doyle's words. She took a deep breath, then declared, each word clear and resolute. "My name is not Brenda Jackson." The whole room held its breath. All eyes were on her. "I am Senior Special Agent in Charge, Brianna Johnson." She paused, letting the name and title sink in. "Office of Inspector General, United States Department of Justice." She read off her federal agent number. "OIG badge number 7492. Absolute shock gripped everyone. Doyle and O'Malley stood frozen in place. The colors on their faces changed rapidly, from bewilderment to disbelief, then to utter horror as the horrible truth began to sink in. Doyle's mouth fell open, speechless. O'Malley began to shake uncontrollably, his legs threatening to give way. Justice Department? Federal agents? Undercover? I am on official federal duty, Brianna continued, her voice uncompromising, under the authority of the Inspector General, to investigate serious allegations of systemic misconduct, gross violations of civil rights, racism, sexism, abuse of power, and suspected corruption directed at two individuals, Deputy Chief Arthur Doyle and Officer Timothy O'Malley. No, it can't be, Doyle finally managed to get the words out, his voice cracking with panic. You're lying. This is a trick. You can't be. Oh, I can, and I am, Brianna interrupted, her eyes cold. And just so you two are in no doubt, she said, her voice firm, every action, every word you've said over the past few weeks, including the racist comments, the harassing behavior, the ambiguous conversations, and especially, she emphasized, the entire proceedings in this courtroom today, from the taunts, the humiliation, the physical assault, to the unlawful arrest of me with these handcuffs, have all been fully recorded by the Department of Justice's audio and video recording equipment. She glanced at her lapel pin and pen. The evidence against you two is incontrovertible, and it will stand up in federal court. There was no doubt now. The cover had been blown. The truth had been revealed in dramatic and shocking fashion. Two abusers of power, in their hubris and stupidity, had walked into a trap of their own making, and they had done it in front of the federal agent they had just attacked. The game was up. Almost as Brianna's final words rang out, the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 5 swung open with a resounding thud. 3 people, 2 men, 1 woman, dressed in plain clothes but with an air of agility, professionalism, and authority stepped inside. They moved with purpose, their sharp eyes scanning the room, assessing the situation in a split second. They were none other than Brianna's support team from the Office of Inspector General, OIG, who had been stationed in the building and the surrounding area, ready to intervene at a moment's notice, or should the situation escalate to dangerous levels, as it had just now. The man in the lead, a tall man in his 40s with short black hair and a stern face, held up the shiny badge pinned to his belt. Supervisory Special Agent Michael Ramirez, OIG, United States Department of Justice, he announced, his voice loud, clear, and authoritative, drowning out the surprised murmurs in the room. Everyone, please remain in position. The federal police are on duty. Without hesitation, Agent Ramirez walked straight toward Brianna, where she stood, hands cuffed behind her back, between 2 now shocked police officers. Agent Johnson, Ramirez asked, his voice both concerned and serious. Are you okay? He motioned for the female agent in the group to step forward, who quickly retrieved a special key and unlocked Brianna's handcuffs. Brianna rubbed her red wrists. I'm fine, Mike, she replied, her voice back to its usual calm. Everything happened exactly as we feared. Or worse. But the evidence is in. Ramirez nodded, then turned to face Doyle and O'Malley, his eyes unforgiving. Arthur Doyle, Timothy O'Malley, he said clearly, you are hereby arrested by a federal tribunal. You are charged under Section 242 of Title 18 of the United States Code with deprivation of civil rights under the law. Section 111 of Title 18 of the United States Code with assault upon a federal officer in the performance of his official duties, obstruction of justice, and other charges relating to corruption and abuse of power as set forth in the indictment. The 2 remaining male agents quickly closed in on Doyle and O'Malley. They expertly stripped the officers of their weapons, radios, and badges without any resistance. Doyle and O'Malley, who had been so powerful and arrogant 5 minutes before, now stood as still as statues, pale-faced and trembling, handcuffed in sturdy federal handcuffs. The contrast was ironic and stark. Meanwhile, Judge Henderson, after the initial shock and realization of the true magnitude of the case, quickly regained his composure as a presiding judge. He stood at the podium, banging his gavel. Court number 2023 CV0178 is adjourned indefinitely, he announced, his voice steady again. I ask that everyone except the immediate parties and federal law enforcement officers please leave the courtroom in an orderly manner. Court staff, please secure the scene. The entire transcript of today's hearing must be sealed immediately. He looked at Agent Ramirez. The Montgomery County District Court will cooperate fully with the Department of Justice's investigation. Ramirez nodded his thanks. The DOJ agents began to systematically go about their work. They seized Brianna's pen and pen as key pieces of evidence. They asked the court's IT staff to provide all the security camera footage from the courtroom and hallways in the past few weeks. They also prepared to take formal statements from Judge Henderson, Mr. Miller, opposing counsel, the court clerk, and anyone else who had witnessed the incident. Mr. Miller's small civil lawsuit over his lease now pales into insignificance compared to the legal earthquake that had just occurred. Mr. Miller's case was quickly settled by his new attorney in the aftermath, with a result that was entirely in his favor as a small compensation for what he had witnessed and experienced. Doyle and O'Malley were escorted out of the courtroom by federal agents amid silence and curious, shocked looks from court staff and those in the hallway. Their lives and careers had taken an irreversible turn, and their next destination was no longer home, but federal prison. Justice, in the form of plainclothes agents and strict federal law, had finally arrived in courtroom 5, albeit in an unexpected way. The arrest of 2 police officers, including a deputy sheriff, in the courtroom by federal agents sent shockwaves through not only the Montgomery County District Court, but also the entire Maryland judicial system, and captured national attention. News of the Justice Department's secret investigation and dramatic expose quickly made it to major news outlets. The case became a clear and alarming demonstration of the troubling issues of abuse of power, racial discrimination, and the need for effective oversight of law enforcement. The Montgomery County Sheriff's Office, faced with overwhelming evidence and overwhelming public pressure, acted swiftly. Arthur Doyle and Timothy O'Malley were immediately suspended and then fired from the department within days of the arrest. Doyle's 2-decade-long career and O'Malley's fledgling career both ended in disgrace. Not stopping there, with a massive and undeniable amount of evidence, the U.S. Department of Justice has officially prosecuted Arthur Doyle and Timothy O'Malley in federal court on a series of serious charges, including those with very severe penalties, such as intentional violation of civil rights and assault on federal employees. The trial took place several months later and attracted intense public and media attention. The federal prosecutor presented the case systematically, exposing the entire web of wrongdoing by the 2 defendants. Audio and video recordings were played in the courtroom, causing outrage and disgust. Brianna Johnson, this time appearing as a federal agent and key witness, once again gave a calm, clear, and convincing account of the incident. She not only recounted what happened to her, but also linked it to other evidence of systematic misconduct by Doyle and O'Malley against many others. Her testimony was a major blow to the defense's weak defense. Defense attorneys for Doyle and O'Malley tried their best to downplay the incident, claiming it was a misunderstanding, overreaction to a stressful situation, or even trying to blame Brianna for provoking them. However, all of these arguments are ridiculous and baseless when faced with objectively recorded images and audio. After carefully weighing the evidence and arguments, it didn't take long for the federal jury to reach a verdict. Both Arthur Doyle and Timothy O'Malley were found guilty on all major counts. The sentencing hearing took place in a packed courtroom. The federal judge, before handing down his sentence, gave a fiery speech, emphasizing the sacredness of the courtroom and the grave betrayal of trust when those entrusted with the duty of upholding justice trample it. He spoke of the devastating impact that racism and abuse of power have on public confidence in the judicial system. He also emphasized the seriousness of assaulting a federal officer in the performance of his duties. Finally, the verdict was handed down. Given the seriousness, the repeated behavior, and the blatant abuse that took place in the courtroom, the judge decided to impose a harsh sentence to send a clear message. Arthur Doyle and Timothy O'Malley were each sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. 7 years in prison. That was the price they paid for their years of violence, their arrogance, their toxic prejudices, and their stupidity that finally brought it all to an end. Justice, however slow and difficult at times, had finally spoken loudly. The 7-year prison sentences handed down to Arthur Doyle and Timothy O'Malley have resonated not only as a fitting punishment for the two criminals, but also as a stern warning to all those in positions of power in the law enforcement and judicial systems. Abuse will not be tolerated, and accountability is inevitable. For Breonna Johnson, the successful conclusion of the case was a validation of her efforts and the risks she took. Her courage, professionalism, and ability to remain calm in a dangerous situation were recognized and appreciated by her superiors at the OIG and the Department of Justice. Her reputation as a talented, sharp, and determined investigator was further cemented. She quietly returned to her quiet but vital work, continuing to fight corruption and injustice from within the system. The Montgomery incident was a reminder of the dangers that lurked in her work, but it also gave her strength and meaning to her mission. At the Montgomery County Courthouse, the scandal involving Doyle and O'Malley forced the administration to make far-reaching and necessary changes. A comprehensive review of the supervision procedures for security staff and police officers working at the courthouse was conducted. Additional security cameras were installed in many areas that had previously been overlooked. More importantly, mandatory training programs on anti-discrimination, identifying and managing unconscious bias, professional ethics, and de-escalation techniques were implemented for all courthouse staff, including judges. Judge Henderson and his colleagues are now much more alert to any signs of abuse of power or inappropriate behavior in their courtroom. The atmosphere in the courthouse has gradually changed, becoming more professional and respectful, even at the cost of a high-profile scandal. The lesson of this story is profound. It illustrates the stark truth that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law. It highlights the dangers of power that fall into the hands of those who harbor toxic racial and gender biases, and when that power is not tightly controlled and monitored. The existence of people like Doyle and O'Malley can erode public trust and undermine the foundations of an entire justice system. The story also underscores the indispensable role of strong internal oversight mechanisms and independent agencies such as the Office of Inspector General, OIG, in detecting, investigating, and prosecuting wrongdoing, ensuring accountability, and contributing to the integrity of public institutions. And sometimes the best way to deal with those who live in the shadows is to pull them into the light in the most unexpected way. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you like this content, please click like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next meaningful stories, because tomorrow we will have another meaningful story for you.